A name that refuses to fade. A warrior whose roar echoed across the battlefield. A king whose mere existence sent shivers down the spine of the British Empire. Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. They called him a rebel. They called him a tyrant. But to his people, he was a leader, a visionary, and the last great force standing between India and total British domination. But history is never kind to those who defy an empire. The victors write the stories, and the fallen become shadows. Today, we break those shadows. Today, we uncover the truth about the man who shook the foundations of colonial rule. Who was Tipu Sultan? A fearless warrior who refused to bow, or a king who pushed the limits of his own power? A hero of India's first war of independence, or a ruler whose legacy was buried under propaganda and politics? His story begins not with power, but with fire. The fire of resistance. The fire of revolution. And a fire that would burn until his very last breath. Tipu Sultan was not born into peace. He was born into war. Raised under the military genius of his father, Hyder Ali, he learned the art of battle before he even learned the art of rule. He was trained not as a prince, but as a warrior. And at the age of just 15, he was already leading armies into battle. But Tipu was not just a soldier. He was a mastermind. A man who saw war not just as a clash of swords, but as a game of intelligence, strategy, and power. He was the architect of modern warfare, the man who developed the Mysorean rockets, weapons so advanced that even the British later copied them. But his real war was not just on the battlefield. It was against the British Empire itself. The East India Company had one goal, to conquer India, piece by piece, ruler by ruler. And one by one, the kingdoms of India began to fall. The British had seen many kings, many warriors, many rulers who surrendered to their power. But Tipu Sultan was different. He was the one they could never tame. He fought them in not one, not two, but 4 wars. For times, he faced the full force of the British and their allies. For times, he stood his ground. He refused to sign away his kingdom. He refused to bow. But when a ruler becomes powerful, enemies don't just come from outside, they come from within. The Marathas. The Nizam of Hyderabad. Betrayal ran deep. Tipu was surrounded, not just by British cannons, but by spies, traitors, and those who feared his vision. And then came the final battle. Seringapatam, 1799. The British surrounded his fortress. Their cannons roared. The walls of Mysore shook. His men fell, one by one. But Tipu? He stood tall. He fought, sword in hand, till the very last breath. And when the British finally found his body, it was not hidden in a palace. It was not lying in surrender. It was at the very gates of his fortress, where he had fallen, fighting. Even in death, Tipu Sultan defied them. But empires do not just conquer land. They conquer stories. The British looted his kingdom, stole his treasures, erased his legacy. They rewrote history to make him a villain, to make his vision disappear. But can a tiger's roar ever be silenced? Even today, his name sparks fear. His story sparks debate. His legend refuses to die. Some call him India's first freedom fighter. Some call him a ruthless warrior. But the question remains, who was Tipu Sultan? A hero or a tyrant? A savior or a shadow? History has one version. But the truth? The truth is waiting to be uncovered. And today, we uncover it. This is the story of Tipu Sultan. The man who would rather die a tiger than live as a slave. Stay with us as we reveal the battles, the betrayals, and the legend that refused to die. In the heart of southern India, in a land of warriors and conquerors, a child was born who would one day shake the very foundations of an empire. His name was Fatih Ali, but the world would come to know him as Tipu Sultan. He was not just the son of a powerful ruler, he was the heir to a legacy of resistance, a boy who would grow into a man whose name would become synonymous with defiance. His birth was no ordinary event. It was the beginning of a storm, a prophecy of the battles to come, a symbol of the fire that would one day consume the enemy. He was born on December 1, 1751, in Devanahalli, a small but significant town near Bangalore. His father, Hyder Ali, was a military genius, a man who had risen from the ranks of an ordinary soldier to become the most feared ruler of Mysore. His mother, Fatima Fakir-Nisa, came from a respected noble family, and from her, Tipu inherited not just his sharp intellect, but a deep sense of purpose. His parents named him Fatih Ali, meaning victorious, but he was soon given another name, Tipu, after the revered Sufi saint, Tipu Mastan Aulia. Perhaps it was fate that a child named after a saint would one day fight like a warrior. Unlike many princes who grew up in luxury, Tipu Sultan's childhood was anything but ordinary. From the moment he could walk, he was surrounded by the echoes of war, the clanking of swords, the thunder of cannons, and the whispered secrets of diplomacy. His father was not just a ruler, he was a warrior, constantly engaged in battles to defend and expand his kingdom. And Tipu was by his side, learning the ways of war long before he was expected to. He was trained by some of the greatest military minds of the time, warriors from Persia, officers from the French army, and seasoned generals who had fought in countless battles. By the age of 10, he was already mastering the sword, the bow, and the musket. By 12, he could ride a horse like a seasoned cavalryman. And by 15, he was leading his own troops into battle. But war was only one part of his education. Tipu Sultan was not just a fighter, he was a scholar, a thinker, and a strategist. His father knew that true power was not just won on the battlefield but in the mind. And so, from a young age, Tipu was given the best education possible. He studied the Quran, mastering its verses not just as a religious text, but as a guide to leadership. He learned Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, becoming fluent in multiple languages to ensure he could communicate with diplomats, scholars, and warriors alike. His education was not limited to the study of religion and language. He was taught mathematics, astronomy, and engineering, subjects that would later help him revolutionize his military tactics. He was fascinated by technology, by the advancements of European warfare, and by the strategies used by great conquerors of history. He studied the lives of Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon, analyzing their victories and their defeats, understanding what made a ruler truly unstoppable. His education was also deeply political. He was raised to understand alliances, to read between the lines of treaties, to sense betrayal before it happened. From a young age, he was sent on diplomatic missions, representing his father's interests in the courts of powerful rulers. At just 17, he was sent to the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad, a man whose loyalty wavered between the British and Mysore. It was here that Tipu first tasted the world of political deception, of shifting alliances and hidden agendas. He learned that power was not just about strength, but about intelligence, about knowing when to strike and when to wait. He learned that words could be as dangerous as swords, that a single agreement could shape the future of a kingdom. But his most valuable lessons were learned not in the safety of a palace, but on the battlefield. At just 15, he rode alongside his father in the invasion of Malabar, leading a cavalry unit of 2,000 men. It was here that he first proved himself, capturing a heavily guarded fort through sheer tactical brilliance. He showed no hesitation, no fear, only a sharp mind and an iron will. His father, proud of his son's success, entrusted him with even greater responsibilities. He was given command of multiple districts, governing them with discipline and fairness. He was being groomed for something far greater than just ruling a kingdom. He was being prepared to defend it against the greatest threat of all, the British. The British East India Company had already begun its slow conquest of India. One by one, they had toppled rulers, captured territories, and established their grip over the subcontinent. But Mysore was different. Mysore was strong. Mysore had Hyder Ali. And Mysore had Tipu Sultan. The British had underestimated the young prince, assuming that he was merely a shadow of his father. But they were wrong. Tipu was not just a reflection of Hyder Ali, he was a storm waiting to be unleashed. His first real encounter with the British came during the First Anglo-Mysore War. While his father led the main army, Tipu was entrusted with leading independent raids against British forces. He moved like lightning, striking before they could react, disappearing before they could counterattack. He disrupted supply lines, cut off reinforcements, and instilled fear in the hearts of his enemies. The British had never seen warfare like this before. It was not just brute force, it was strategy, it was speed, it was the beginning of something far greater. By the time he was 20, Tipu Sultan was no longer just a prince, he was a legend in the making. He had proven himself as a commander, a diplomat, and a leader. But more importantly, he had proven that Mysore was not just another kingdom waiting to be conquered. It was a fortress, a symbol of resistance, a land that would not fall easily. As the years passed, his reputation grew. He became known as the Tiger of Mysore, a name that would follow him until his very last breath. But his journey was just beginning. The battles ahead would be fiercer, the betrayals deeper, and the challenges greater. He would face enemies not just from the outside, but from within. He would fight wars not just against the British, but against time itself. But one thing was certain, Tipu Sultan was not a man who would go down without a fight. He had been trained for this. He had been prepared for this. And when the moment came, when the British returned stronger than before, he would be ready. This was not just the story of a prince. This was the making of a warrior. The rise of a legend. The birth of a tiger whose roar would echo through history. From the moment he first set foot on the battlefield, Tipu Sultan was not just a prince, he was a force of nature. He had inherited his father's strength, but he had something more, a mind sharpened by strategy, an instinct that could read the movements of his enemies before they even made them. He was not a ruler who sent orders from behind the safety of palace walls, he was a warrior who rode into battle, leading from the front, standing shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers, his sword flashing through the air as he cut through enemy lines. Tipu's journey into warfare began when he was just 15 years old. He was no ordinary boy. Where others his age spent their days in comfort, Tipu spent his in rigorous training. His father had made sure of that. He had been trained by the best, learning the art of war from Persian, Arab, and even French military experts. His hands were not just skilled with the sword, but with firearms, cannons, and a weapon that would one day terrify the British, the Mysorean rockets. But no training, no lessons, could ever prepare a man for the brutality of war. That had to be learned on the battlefield itself. His first true test came in 1766 when Hyder Ali, his father and ruler of Mysore, led an invasion into Malabar. It was a land of fierce resistance, where rulers held strongholds deep within the dense forests and rugged mountains. But Hyder Ali knew he had a secret weapon, his son, Tipu. He assigned the young prince a small cavalry force, giving him a mission that would determine if he was ready for war. The task was simple: capture a heavily guarded enemy fort. But nothing in war is ever simple. Tipu and his men rode under the cover of darkness, their movements silent, their plan swift. The enemy forces inside the fort had no idea that a storm was about to strike them. Tipu led his cavalry with precision, outmaneuvering the enemy guards, cutting through the defenses, and within hours, the fort had fallen. It was his first victory, but it was not just a battle won, it was a message sent. A message that a new warrior had entered the battlefield, one who would soon be feared by enemies far greater than those in Malabar. But Malabar was just the beginning. Tipu did not just fight for conquest, he fought with a vision. He understood that war was not just about strength but about the ability to adapt. And it was this ability that would make him one of the greatest military minds of his time. In 1767, when the First Anglo-Mysore War erupted, Tipu was no longer just a prince, he was a commander. The British East India Company, an empire in the making, was expanding its hold over India. They had crushed rulers before, taken lands with ease, but they had never faced someone like Tipu Sultan. At just 17, Tipu was given an even greater responsibility: diplomacy. Hyder Ali, knowing the importance of alliances, sent Tipu on a mission to the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. The British were trying to lure the Nizam to their side, offering him wealth, power, and influence. But Tipu arrived with something more: respect, understanding, and an offer the Nizam could not refuse. He negotiated not with arrogance, but with intelligence, convincing the Nizam that siding with Mysore was not just beneficial, but necessary. And just like that, Tipu had turned the tide, securing an alliance that would help Mysore stand against the British. But words could only take a man so far. War was the true test of a leader, and Tipu was ready. The British had underestimated him. They saw a young prince, not a seasoned warrior. But they would soon learn their mistake. In the heat of battle, Tipu moved like lightning, striking with speed and precision. His cavalry was unlike anything the British had ever faced. They attacked in swift formations, disappearing into the distance before the British could counter. His strategies were not just effective, they were terrifying. The British, who had marched into Mysore thinking of an easy victory, were now fighting not just for conquest, but for survival. The war was brutal, stretching across multiple campaigns, but by 1769, the British had been pushed back. The Treaty of Madras was signed, an agreement that forced the British to recognize Mysore's power. It was a victory, but it was only the beginning. For Tipu, war was not just about defending Mysore, it was about making it stronger. He was not content with simply keeping the British at bay. He wanted to build an empire that could challenge them, an empire that could stand as a beacon of resistance. And so, he did what no other Indian ruler had dared to do: he modernized his army. He did not rely solely on traditional tactics, he embraced innovation. The most famous of these innovations was his development of Mysorean rockets. These were not just ordinary rockets, they were advanced, iron-cased weapons that could travel long distances and explode upon impact. They were fast, unpredictable, and deadly. The British had never seen anything like them. In the years to come, these very rockets would inspire the creation of the Congreve rockets, which the British would later use in the Napoleonic Wars. But his genius did not stop at weaponry. He restructured his army, ensuring that it was disciplined and well-trained. He introduced European military techniques, recruited French officers to train his men, and built one of the most formidable forces in India. He also understood the power of the navy. Unlike many Indian rulers who focused solely on land warfare, Tipu worked to build a strong naval force, recognizing that controlling the seas was just as important as controlling the land. Yet, as he strengthened Mysore, his enemies grew wary. The British saw him not just as a threat, but as an obstacle in their path to total domination. They knew that as long as Tipu Sultan lived, Mysore would never fall. And so, they began plotting. They knew they could not defeat him alone. They needed allies, they needed betrayals, they needed to strike when he least expected it. Tipu was ready for war, but he was about to face something far more dangerous than just the British. He was about to face deception, treachery, and a battle that would change the fate of Mysore forever. Tipu Sultan was no longer just a prince, he was now a warrior feared across the land. The British had underestimated him once, but they would not make that mistake again. The First Anglo-Mysore War had ended with a treaty, but peace was an illusion. Both sides knew that another war was coming, and this time, it would be bigger, bloodier, and more decisive. But Tipu did not waste time waiting for war to reach his doorstep. He prepared. He strengthened his army, fortified his cities, and built weapons that would terrify his enemies. He was not just defending Mysore, he was transforming it into a military superpower. His enemies, however, were not just the British. The Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and other regional powers saw Tipu as a growing threat. He was young, ambitious, and dangerously intelligent. He was changing the way war was fought in India, and that made him unpredictable. The British knew they could not defeat him alone. So, they did what they did best, they created alliances. They turned Tipu's enemies into their allies, promising them power, money, and land in exchange for one thing, the downfall of Mysore. And so, the Second Anglo-Mysore War began. It was 1780, and the British were expanding their influence deeper into southern India. They believed they had the upper hand, but what they did not expect was Tipu Sultan's fury. He struck with the force of a storm, launching an attack so devastating that it left the British reeling. In the Battle of Palila, he used his famous Mysorean rockets to annihilate British forces. These rockets were unlike anything the British had seen before, iron-cased, with a longer range and explosive impact. They ripped through the enemy lines, setting fire to their camps, throwing their formations into chaos. The British, who had always relied on their disciplined army, found themselves running, burning, and falling apart in the face of Tipu's revolutionary weaponry. It was a humiliating defeat for the British. For the first time, an Indian ruler had not just resisted them, he had crushed them. The name of Tipu Sultan spread far beyond India, reaching as far as Europe, where generals and kings marveled at his military genius. The British knew they had to regroup, to rethink their strategies. They could not afford another loss like Palila. But for Tipu, this was just the beginning. The war continued for 4 long years. Battles were fought, cities were taken, and alliances shifted. But despite all the bloodshed, no side could claim absolute victory. In 1784, the Treaty of Mangalore was signed, bringing the war to an end. Unlike other Indian rulers who were forced to surrender territory, Tipu Sultan negotiated a treaty on equal terms. He had forced the British to the table, proving that Mysore was not a land to be conquered, but a force to be reckoned with. But Tipu knew the British too well. He knew they would not honor the treaty forever. He knew that as long as they existed in India, they would continue to expand, to manipulate, to conquer. He did not trust them, and so he prepared for the next war before the ink on the treaty had even dried. He turned his focus toward strengthening Mysore, not just as a military power, but as an economic and technological hub. He introduced new policies, reformed taxation, and encouraged international trade. He developed the silk industry, creating one of the most profitable economic sectors in the region. He was a ruler who saw the future, not just in war, but in prosperity. Mysore flourished under his reign, becoming one of the most advanced states in India. But prosperity did not stop his enemies from scheming against him. In 1789, he made a decision that would change the course of his fate. He launched an attack on the Kingdom of Travancore, a British ally. The British seized this opportunity and, within a year, the Third Anglo-Mysore War began. This time, the British came with full force. They had learned from their mistakes. They had studied Tipu's tactics, prepared for his strategies, and built alliances with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad. It was an all-out invasion, and Mysore was surrounded from all sides. The war was brutal. Tipu fought with everything he had, but the odds were against him. The combined strength of the British, the Marathas, and the Nizam was overwhelming. One by one, Mysore's strongholds began to fall. The British had come prepared for his rockets, for his cavalry, for his tactics. They had studied him, just as he had studied them. After years of resistance, after battles fought with unmatched bravery, Mysore was forced into surrender. The Treaty of Seringapatam was signed in 1792, and it was a crushing blow. Half of Mysore's territory was taken. Tipu Sultan was forced to pay a massive indemnity. And worst of all, he had to give up his 2 sons as hostages to the British. For Tipu, it was not just a political loss, it was personal. The British had taken his blood, his lineage, his future. But even in defeat, he did not bow. He did not kneel. Instead, he plotted his return. For the next few years, Tipu rebuilt Mysore. He strengthened what remained of his kingdom, preparing for the final battle that he knew would come. He reached out to Napoleon Bonaparte, seeking an alliance against the British. He wrote letters to the Ottoman Empire, to Persia, to Afghanistan, hoping to unite the Islamic world against the colonizers. He had lost a war, but he had not lost his fight. But the British had already decided his fate. They could not allow Tipu Sultan to rise again. They saw him as the last great threat to their domination over India. And so, in 1799, they launched the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, not just to defeat him, but to eliminate him forever. Tipu Sultan knew this was his final stand. He knew there would be no treaties, no negotiations, no peace. The British had brought everything they had, an army of nearly 50,000 soldiers, armed with the latest weaponry, led by commanders who had only one mission, to end Tipu Sultan. The Battle of Seringapatam was unlike any other. The walls of his fortress shook under the barrage of British cannons. The ground trembled as thousands of enemy troops stormed the gates. His men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and betrayed by those within. But Tipu? He refused to surrender. He fought with his sword till the very end, cutting down British soldiers one after another, refusing to flee, refusing to fall back. His men begged him to escape, but he stood his ground. And then, a bullet struck him. His body fell among his soldiers, not in retreat, but in battle. The Tiger of Mysore had fought till his last breath. When the British found his body, he was lying with his sword still in his hand. They had won the battle, but they had not broken him. Even in death, Tipu Sultan had defied them. His kingdom was looted. His treasures were taken. His palace was stripped of its glory. But they could not erase his name. They could not silence his legend. Even today, his story stands as a reminder that true warriors do not kneel. True kings do not surrender. And true legends never die. Tipu Sultan had fought wars, conquered lands, and stood against one of the most powerful empires in the world. But beyond the battlefield, beyond the bloodshed and strategy, he was also a ruler with a vision, one that extended beyond war. His mind was not just focused on military conquests but also on governance, diplomacy, and the well-being of his people. Unlike many rulers of his time, he did not believe in ruling through fear alone. He believed in justice, in the prosperity of his kingdom, and in the power of kindness. But kindness, in the world of politics and war, was a double-edged sword. It could inspire loyalty, but it could also be mistaken for weakness. And for a man like Tipu Sultan, any sign of weakness could be exploited by his enemies. His father, Hyder Ali, had laid the foundations of a strong Mysore, and Tipu had taken it even further. His administration was organized, his economy was thriving, and his military was more advanced than any other in India. But he understood one fundamental truth: a ruler is nothing without the trust and love of his people. He did not see himself as just a king, he saw himself as a guardian, a leader whose duty was to protect and uplift those under his rule. And that is where his acts of kindness began to shape his legacy. Tipu Sultan was known for his generosity. He personally ensured that farmers were given land, that the poor were provided for, and that temples, mosques, and churches were all protected under his rule. He did not see religion as a tool for division, he saw it as a bridge for unity. In an era where rulers were often biased toward their own faith, Tipu stood apart. He gave grants to Hindu temples, he donated to religious institutions, and he maintained a balance that few rulers dared to uphold. It was not politics, it was his belief that a kingdom was strongest when its people, regardless of faith, stood together. But it was not just grand gestures that defined his kindness. It was in the small moments, the decisions made not for power, but for humanity. Stories of his generosity spread across the land, whispered from village to village. One such story tells of a poor farmer who had lost everything, his land, his cattle, and his means of survival. When the man came before Tipu, expecting punishment for failing to pay his dues, he was met with something else entirely. Tipu did not demand payment. Instead, he forgave the debt, provided the man with new land, and ensured that he had enough to start again. A king does not take from the hands of the starving, he had said. A true king ensures that his people never have to beg. His kindness extended even to those who had once stood against him. He had fought wars, taken prisoners, and defeated enemies, but he was not a man of unnecessary cruelty. When British prisoners were captured during the wars, they expected the worst. They had seen what their own commanders did to Indian soldiers, they had witnessed torture, executions, and unspeakable horrors. But in Tipu Sultan's camp, they were treated with dignity. He provided them with food, shelter, and even medical aid. He ensured that they were not mistreated, that they were given fair conditions. A warrior's strength is measured not just in battle, but in mercy, he had once said. Even his enemies could not deny that he was different. He was not just a conqueror, he was a man who believed in honor. One of the most remarkable stories of his kindness was his relationship with the Sringeri Sharoda Peetham, a Hindu monastery. In the midst of war, the Marathas had raided the monastery, looting it and desecrating its sacred grounds. When Tipu Sultan learned of this, he did something no one expected. He did not ignore it. He did not use it as an opportunity to further his own political agenda. Instead, he wrote to the head of the monastery, expressing his sorrow for what had happened. He sent funds to rebuild the temple, ensured that the priests were safe, and personally oversaw the restoration efforts. A king must protect not just his throne, but the faith of his people, he wrote in one of his letters. But acts of kindness do not always win wars. They do not always silence enemies. And they do not always secure loyalty. Tipu Sultan's rule was still surrounded by treachery, by those who saw his kindness as a weakness. His enemies spread rumors, claiming that he favored one group over another, that he was too lenient, too merciful. The British, masters of psychological warfare, used this to their advantage. They painted him as a tyrant in some regions, as an overly generous fool in others. They played both sides, using misinformation as a weapon sharper than any sword. But Tipu Sultan was not blind to these tactics. He knew that war was not just fought with armies but with perception. He strengthened his alliances, continued to invest in his people, and built a network of spies to root out traitors. He had seen what happened to rulers who became complacent, who trusted too easily. And so, he remained vigilant, always one step ahead. But no man, no matter how great, could stand against betrayal forever. One of his most trusted commanders, Mir Sadiq, was a man Tipu had once believed to be loyal. He had fought alongside him, had served Mysore for years. But the British had a way of turning loyalty into greed. They promised Mir Sadiq wealth, power, and a future beyond Mysore. And he took it. It was the ultimate betrayal, one that would lead Tipu Sultan to his final battle. On the eve of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, as British forces surrounded Seringapatam, Tipu's fortress, Mir Sadiq played his part. At the height of battle, he ordered Tipu's men to stop fighting under the pretense of distributing wages. In that moment of confusion, the British forces broke through the defenses. The gates of Seringapatam were thrown open, not by force, but by treachery. Tipu Sultan fought, as he always had, refusing to surrender, refusing to bow. His kindness, his generosity, his belief in loyalty, none of it could save him from the betrayal that had been planted within his own ranks. And so, the man who had shown mercy to his enemies, who had rebuilt temples and protected prisoners, met his end on the battlefield. His body was found among his soldiers, not in retreat, but in defiance. His kindness had shaped his rule, but it had not saved his throne. His vision had transformed Mysore, but it had not shielded it from treachery. The British had won the battle, but they had not broken the legend of Tipu Sultan. Even today, his story stands as a testament to the power of leadership, of strength tempered with compassion. He was a warrior, but he was also a king who understood that ruling was not just about conquering land, but about winning the hearts of people. His kindness was not a weakness. It was his greatest strength. And it is why, even after centuries, his name is remembered, not just as the Tiger of Mysore, but as a ruler who understood the true meaning of power. Tipu Sultan's entire life had been a war against the British, against betrayal, and against time itself. But what made him different from every other ruler who had fought the British was not just his courage, not just his military brilliance, but his ability to see beyond war. He was not just a man of the sword, he was a man of vision. He saw a future where Mysore was not just a kingdom, but an empire, one that could stand on its own, independent, prosperous, and untouchable. He had spent years fighting to build that future, pouring his heart into every battle, every reform, every decision. And yet, as the war raged on, as the enemy closed in, that future began slipping away. The British had turned his allies against him. His enemies had surrounded him. The walls of Seringapatam, his beloved capital, were under siege. But even then, even in the face of certain destruction, Tipu Sultan was not thinking of surrender. He was thinking of something far greater, his final move, the last act that would define his legacy forever. The British believed that once they killed him, once they captured Seringapatam, Mysore would fall. But Tipu Sultan knew better. He knew that the strength of a kingdom did not lie in its walls or its weapons, but in its people. And so, even as he fought his final battle, he ensured that his greatest legacy, the wealth, the knowledge, the strength of Mysore, would not be lost. It is said that in the weeks leading up to the siege, Tipu Sultan gave secret orders. Orders that would ensure that even if Mysore was conquered, its spirit would never die. He instructed his most trusted advisors to take Mysore's treasures, its gold, its jewels, its priceless artifacts, and hide them where the British would never find them. Entire caravans disappeared into the night, carrying the wealth of a kingdom into the depths of hidden vaults, into secret locations that remain undiscovered even today. The British believed they had looted Mysore's riches, but they only found what Tipu Sultan had allowed them to find. But treasure was not the only thing he sought to protect. Tipu Sultan knew that the British did not just want his kingdom, they wanted his legacy. They wanted to erase his name, rewrite history, turn him into nothing more than a forgotten footnote. He could not allow that. And so, he made one final move, one that would ensure that his name would live on, even if Mysore itself fell. He gathered his most trusted scholars, his closest allies, and entrusted them with a task, to record everything. Every battle, every strategy, every innovation. The knowledge of Mysore's military advancements, its rockets, its economic policies, its scientific discoveries, everything that had made his kingdom strong. And then, he ordered those records to be taken far from Mysore, beyond the reach of the British. Some say they were smuggled out of India entirely, hidden in places where the British would never think to look. Others believe they were left behind, buried beneath Mysore itself, waiting to be rediscovered. Even as he prepared for battle, even as he faced the possibility of death, Tipu Sultan's mind was working, planning, ensuring that his fight would not end with him. He knew he would not live forever, but ideas, knowledge, and resistance could outlast even the strongest empires. But the British had their own plans. They did not just want to defeat him, they wanted to crush him, to destroy his legacy before it could ever take root. They had learned from past wars. They had studied him, prepared for his tactics, and gathered the strongest army they had ever sent against Mysore. This was not just another battle. This was an extermination. As the cannons roared and the walls of Seringapatam began to collapse, Tipu Sultan's fate was sealed. The British forces stormed the city, breaking through the defenses, pushing towards the palace. Inside, Tipu knew that this was his final stand. His men begged him to escape, to flee and fight another day. But Tipu Sultan was not a man who ran. He was not a man who surrendered. And so, he stood. Sword in hand, he fought. His bodyguards fell around him, one by one, but he did not stop. He cut down British soldiers as they stormed the palace, his strength undiminished, his spirit unbroken. Even when bullets tore through his body, he did not fall. He continued to fight, refusing to let his enemies see him weak, refusing to give them the satisfaction of his surrender. Then, a final shot struck him. The man who had never bowed in life, never bowed in death. He fell, his sword still clutched in his hand, his blood mixing with the dust of his beloved Mysore. And with that, the Tiger of Mysore was gone. The British celebrated. They had won. The city had fallen. Mysore was theirs. But what they did not realize, what they could not realize, was that Tipu Sultan had already ensured that his battle would continue long after his death. When they ransacked the palace, they found treasures beyond imagination, gold, jewels, artifacts of immense value. But they did not find everything. The true wealth of Mysore, the true legacy of Tipu Sultan, had already been taken beyond their reach. His records, his secrets, his knowledge, they had disappeared, scattered across lands beyond British control. Even in death, he had outwitted them. But there was something else. Something the British did not expect. When they found his body, lying among his fallen soldiers, they discovered something chilling. His face was calm. His expression was not one of fear, not one of pain. It was defiance. Even in death, Tipu Sultan had denied them the victory they craved. And so, the British did what they had done to so many before. They erased him. They looted his city, tore down his banners, took his sword, his throne, his possessions, and sent them away to distant lands. They rewrote history, painting him as a tyrant, distorting his image, turning him into a shadow. But a shadow can never fully disappear. Because Tipu Sultan had planned for this. He had ensured that his name would never be forgotten. He had left behind more than just stories, he had left behind a fire. A fire that would burn in the hearts of those who would come after him. A fire that would one day rise again. Even today, more than 2 centuries later, the story of Tipu Sultan remains alive. His lost treasures, his hidden secrets, his unbreakable spirit, they continue to captivate minds, to spark debates, to inspire revolutions. The British believed that killing him would end his fight. But they were wrong. Because true warriors never die. They become legends. The walls of Seringapatam were stained with blood. The echoes of battle had faded into silence, leaving behind a city in ruins, a people in mourning, and an empire that had lost its heart. Tipu Sultan was no more. The Tiger of Mysore, the man who had fought against the might of the British Empire until his last breath, had fallen. His body lay lifeless, but his legacy had only just begun. The British had won the war, but in their victory, they had awakened something far greater, a legend that would never die. As the sun set on the battlefield, British officers stood over his body, staring at the man who had been their greatest nightmare for decades. He was no ordinary ruler. He was no ordinary enemy. Even in death, he commanded respect. His sword was still in his grip, his eyes still fierce, as if he had not fallen, but had simply chosen to rest. The British general, standing above him, is said to have whispered, "Now India is ours." But the truth was far more complicated. The fall of Tipu Sultan did not mark the beginning of British rule, it marked the beginning of their greatest challenge. His death sent shockwaves across India. Kings who had once feared him now feared what his absence meant. If Tipu, the strongest warrior among them, had fallen, then who was next? The British wasted no time in stripping Mysore of its glory. They looted the city, ransacking the palace, taking every last piece of treasure, every last artifact that spoke of Tipu Sultan's greatness. His golden throne, adorned with the symbol of a tiger, was dismantled, its precious gems taken to London. His prized sword, the very weapon that had struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, was carried away as a trophy of war. The British took everything they could, but they could not take the spirit of Mysore. The people of Mysore did not just lose their king, they lost their protector, their symbol of defiance. The streets of the once mighty kingdom were filled with grief. The man who had fought for them, who had refused to bow, who had stood between them and total British domination, was gone. But his presence lingered. Every marketplace, every temple, every home whispered his name. Stories of his bravery spread like wildfire. He was no longer just a ruler, he had become something greater, an idea, a force that could not be erased. The British, knowing the power of a name, attempted to rewrite history. They painted him as a tyrant, as a ruthless ruler who had oppressed his people. They filled their records with propaganda, twisting his victories into crimes, his resistance into rebellion. But no amount of ink could wash away the truth. The people who had lived under his rule knew who he was. They knew that he had fought not for personal gain, but for freedom. They knew that he had built a Mysore that was stronger, richer, and more advanced than any other kingdom in India. The British installed a puppet ruler in Mysore, restoring the Wadjar dynasty that Tipu and his father had once dethroned. They believed that by placing a weak ruler on the throne, they could control Mysore forever. But Mysore was never the same again. It had lost its teeth, its fire, its tiger. The land that had once stood as a fortress against British expansion was now just another piece in their growing empire. But even as the British celebrated their victory, they could not escape the ghost of Tipu Sultan. In London, his artifacts were placed in museums, his name spoken with both fear and admiration. His innovations, particularly his legendary Mysorean rockets, were studied by European scientists, eventually inspiring the development of modern rocketry. The very weapons that had once terrorized British soldiers on the battlefield were now being adapted into future wars. Back in India, his legend grew with every passing year. The fire he had ignited did not die with him, it spread. Revolutionaries, freedom fighters, and warriors who would rise in the years to come carried his name like a banner. Rani Lakshmi Bai, Bhagat Singh, Subhas Chandra Bose. They all looked to Tipu Sultan as a symbol of resistance. His story became a beacon for those who refused to accept foreign rule. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Tipu Sultan's life was not just his bravery, but his vision. He had been more than a warrior, he had been a builder, a reformer, a thinker ahead of his time. He had introduced policies that strengthened the economy, created industries that thrived even under siege, and developed military technology that was years ahead of the British. He had understood the power of alliances, of diplomacy, of progress. He had not just fought for Mysore, he had built Mysore into something that could stand on its own. Had he lived longer, had betrayal not opened the gates of Seringapatam, had his vision been allowed to flourish, history might have been different. But history is not written in what ifs. It is written in the actions of men who refuse to be forgotten. And Tipu Sultan refused to be forgotten. Today, centuries later, his name still sparks debate. Some call him a hero, a freedom fighter who saw the British for what they were, invaders who would stop at nothing to take India. Others call him controversial, questioning his methods, his policies, his wars. But no matter how history chooses to frame him, one fact remains undeniable: he was the last great ruler who stood against British rule before India truly fell under their control. He was the last obstacle in their path, the last king who made them fear that India might never be theirs. Even now, across Mysore, across India, the echoes of his reign remain. His summer palace, his forts, his innovations, they are reminders of a time when India had a ruler who did not just dream of freedom but was willing to die for it. His lost treasures, hidden somewhere in the depths of history, symbolize the unfinished story of his kingdom. His letters to Napoleon, his alliances with distant lands, his efforts to bring together an army that could push the British out, these were not the acts of a desperate man. They were the acts of a man who saw a future where India was free. The British thought that by killing Tipu Sultan, they had ended his fight. But they were wrong. Because true warriors never die. Their battles are carried forward, their legacies live on, and their names become immortal. And so, the legend of Tipu Sultan remains, unshaken, unbroken. A man who fought till his last breath. A man who chose death over surrender. A man who proved that even when a kingdom falls, an idea can rise again. And that is why, even today, when we speak of Tipu Sultan, we do not speak of defeat. We speak of resistance. We speak of honor. We speak of a king who refused to kneel, a tiger who never bowed. And that is why, even after centuries, the world still remembers the name of Tipu Sultan. The Battle of Seringapatam had ended, but the echoes of war still lingered in the air. The ground was soaked with the blood of brave warriors, the cries of the fallen still seemed to whisper through the ruins, and the walls that once stood strong now lay shattered. Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, had taken his final stand, and though the British had claimed victory, they had not broken him. His body may have fallen, but his spirit was unyielding, untouchable. The British thought they had destroyed an empire, but what they did not realize was that they had only given birth to a legend. In the days following his death, the British looted Seringapatam, taking with them everything they could: gold, jewels, weapons, and priceless artifacts that spoke of Mysore's greatness. They seized his throne, dismantled its golden structure, and carried it back to their land as a trophy. His sword, the very weapon that had struck fear into their hearts, was taken to London. But no matter how much they looted, no matter how many of his belongings they stole, they could never take what truly mattered: his story. For the people of Mysore, Tipu Sultan was not gone. He was everywhere. In the stories whispered by old men in the streets, in the songs sung by mothers putting their children to sleep, in the very air of the land he had protected. His soldiers, his ministers, even the common people, each of them carried a part of him within their hearts. His name had not been erased, it had been immortalized. The British, in their arrogance, believed that Mysore would now bend to their rule, that the death of Tipu Sultan had broken its will. But they had underestimated the power of a martyr. The people did not forget. They did not forgive. They remembered his courage, his vision, his dream of a free land. And though Mysore had been forced to accept a puppet ruler, the fire that Tipu had ignited did not die. His legacy traveled far beyond the borders of his kingdom. Across India, his story spread, reaching every corner, every ruler, every man and woman who longed for freedom. He had shown them that the British were not invincible, that they could be fought, that they could be defeated. He had proven that resistance was not futile, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one man could make a difference. And as the years passed, as the British tightened their grip over India, the seeds of rebellion that Tipu had planted began to grow. Freedom fighters across the nation took inspiration from him. His name was spoken with reverence by those who fought in the uprisings that followed. The revolt of 1857, the countless struggles against colonial rule, the movements that eventually led to India's independence, all carried within them a piece of Tipu Sultan's spirit. He had not just fought for Mysore, he had fought for something far greater. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of his life was not just his bravery, but his belief in progress, in innovation, in the idea that a kingdom must evolve to survive. He had introduced reforms that strengthened Mysore's economy, built industries that flourished even under siege, and developed military technology that was far ahead of its time. His Mysorean rockets, once feared by the British, would later inspire advancements in modern warfare. His economic policies, his administrative strategies, his vision for a self-sufficient state, these were not just the acts of a king defending his throne. They were the blueprints of a leader who understood that true power lay in the prosperity of his people. Even today, his impact is felt. His contributions to rocketry, his advancements in governance, his relentless pursuit of independence, these are studied, admired, and celebrated. He is remembered not just as a warrior, but as a man who dared to dream beyond his time. But what is a legacy if not a lesson? And Tipu Sultan's greatest lesson was this: true strength is not in conquest, but in resilience. True power is not in riches, but in the hearts of the people. And true freedom is not given, it is fought for, earned, and defended till the very last breath. The British may have taken Mysore, but they could never take his dream. The dream of a land that did not bow to foreign rule. The dream of a people who did not surrender their dignity. The dream of a future where the soil of India was not stained with the footsteps of its oppressors, but with the footprints of those who walked free. And that is why, centuries later, his name still stands tall. That is why, even today, when history speaks of courage, of sacrifice, of unbreakable will, it speaks of Tipu Sultan. Because some men are not just rulers. Some men are revolutions. The story of Tipu Sultan did not end with his death. If anything, it truly began in that moment. His fall at Seringapatam was not just the loss of a king, it was the birth of a legend. He was no longer just a ruler of Mysore, he had become a symbol, an idea, a force that refused to be erased. The British may have taken his throne, his land, and his treasures, but they could not take his name. They could not take what he stood for. As the sun set over the battlefield, as the last echoes of war faded into silence, a question remained: what had they truly won? Tipu Sultan was gone, but in his place, a fire had been lit, one that would burn long after his enemies had gone. That fire lived on in the hearts of his people, in the whispered stories passed down through generations, in the very soil of Mysore that had been drenched in the blood of a warrior who never surrendered. The British believed they had crushed his legacy, but history had other plans. In the years that followed, the seeds of rebellion that Tipu Sultan had planted began to take root. His story inspired those who came after him, freedom fighters, revolutionaries, and leaders who would one day rise to challenge the very empire that had claimed victory over him. His vision of a strong, independent India did not die with him. It only transformed, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And rise it did. Across India, his name became a rallying cry for those who refused to bow to foreign rule. When the great uprisings against the British began, when men and women took to the streets to demand their freedom, they did so with the spirit of Tipu Sultan behind them. His defiance, his resilience, his unshakable belief in independence, these became the foundation upon which the struggle for India's liberation was built. But beyond war, beyond revolution, his legacy had another side, one that was often overlooked in the chaos of battle. Tipu Sultan was not just a warrior, he was a visionary. He saw the world not just in terms of power and conquest, but in terms of progress. He was one of the few rulers of his time who understood that true strength lay not just in armies, but in knowledge, in innovation, in the ability to adapt and grow. His contributions to science, technology, and governance were years ahead of their time. He modernized Mysore's economy, revolutionized its industries, and created a military force that was feared by even the greatest empires. His use of rocketry, his advancements in administration, his policies that promoted trade and self-sufficiency, these were not the actions of a mere king fighting for survival. They were the acts of a man who saw the future, who understood what a nation needed to thrive. And yet, history has not always been kind to him. Over the years, attempts have been made to rewrite his story, to twist his image, to turn him into a figure of controversy rather than admiration. His enemies, both past and present, have tried to erase his contributions, to diminish his role in shaping history. But the truth cannot be buried. The truth, like the man himself, refuses to bow. Tipu Sultan's life teaches us many things, about courage, about sacrifice, about resilience. But above all, it teaches us that true leadership is not about holding power, but about inspiring others. He was not a ruler who lived for himself, he was a ruler who lived for his people, who fought not for personal gain, but for the dream of a nation that could stand on its own, free and strong. His final words, spoken with his last breath, still resonate through time: better to live one day as a tiger than 1,000 years as a sheep. And that is the lesson of Tipu Sultan's life. That no matter how great the odds, no matter how powerful the enemy, true strength lies in the refusal to kneel. That true greatness is not in how long one lives, but in how one is remembered. That true warriors do not die, they become legends. Even today, centuries after his fall, Tipu Sultan's name remains. His legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of those who still believe in justice, in freedom, in the right to stand against oppression. And so, when we look back at his story, when we trace the steps of his journey, we do not see a man who was defeated. We see a man who chose his own fate. We see a king who refused to kneel. We see a tiger who never bowed. We see a flame that still burns.